What drives a man to demand his own death sentence, and then, in a shocking twist, take his fate into his own hands? Scott Dozier, a convicted murderer, spent his final 24 hours in a way few could imagine. After years of challenging the system and insisting on not just his execution, but to speed it up, Dozier's story ended not in the state's hands, but his own early life. Born on November 20th, 1970, in Boulder City, Nevada, a serene desert town nestled close to the Hoover Dam, Scott Raymond Dozier appeared at first glance to have an ordinary start. His family lived in a modest, middle-class household. Life in Boulder City was quiet and steady, the kind of place where most people stayed on predictable paths. For Scott, though, those paths seemed unbearably restrictive. Even as a child, he carried an energy that hinted he wouldn't settle for ordinary. His childhood was, by most accounts, unremarkable. Teachers described him as bright, sharp, and full of potential. He had a natural charisma, often charming both adults and his peers. He wasn't at the top of his class, but his intelligence was undeniable, a quality that could have opened countless doors if channeled in the right direction. Neighbors remembered him as a confident boy, someone who seemed destined for success, though in what form wasn't immediately clear. His family, while not wealthy, provided a stable foundation, giving Scott a relatively secure upbringing. But beneath this surface of normalcy, there were cracks that hinted at a different future. Scott's teachers and family began to notice an underlying restlessness, a refusal to be confined by the rules that governed other children. He wasn't disruptive in the typical sense, but he pushed boundaries, questioning authority and testing limits wherever he could. This trait, while subtle at first, grew more pronounced as he aged. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was something deeper, a drive to carve out his own path, no matter what stood in his way. As he entered his teenage years, Scott's independence streak became more difficult to ignore. While other kids channeled their energy into sports, clubs, or academics, Scott seemed uninterested in conventional achievements. His disdain for authority and structure wasn't just a phase, it was a defining part of his character. Teachers who once praised his intelligence now struggled to manage his indifference toward schoolwork and his growing habit of bending the rules. For Scott, the system felt like a cage, and he wasn't willing to play by its rules. His search for freedom led him to seek thrills in ways that often flirted with danger. He wasn't drawn to petty mischief or simple rebellion. His actions always carried an edge of calculated risk. Friends from this time described a teenager who was fearless, almost to a fault. Whether it was taking a dare, sneaking into restricted areas, or pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable, Scott relished the adrenaline that came with bending the world to his will. He wasn't reckless in the traditional sense. There was always a purpose behind his actions, a sense that he was testing the limits to see just how far he could go. Scott's family, though supportive, began to feel the strain of his behavior. They urged him to focus on his education, to channel his energy into something productive, but their advice often fell on deaf ears. Scott had no interest in following the well-worn paths of his peers, and he made no effort to hide it. The need for independence drove Scott to leave home at an unusually young age. In his late teens, he began to drift, exploring new places and opportunities with the same restless energy that had defined his childhood. Boulder City, with its quiet streets and familiar faces, felt too small for someone like Scott. He wanted to see more, to experience life on his terms, and he wasn't afraid to take risks to get there. For a time, he moved from job to job, picking up work where he could and making just enough to support his next adventure. Those who knew him describe a young man constantly on the move, always searching for the next thrill. It was during this time that Scott's interest in risk began to intertwine with his need for control. He wasn't content simply following the rules of the working world. He wanted to make his own. This mindset led him to dabble in ventures that skirted legality, the first hints of his eventual descent into criminality. These weren't major offenses, small hustles, shortcuts that gave him a taste of the power and independence he craved, but they marked the beginning of a pattern that would define his life in the years to come. Scott's early ventures into independence and risk-taking provided a glimpse into the mindset that would later drive him to infamy. He wasn't content to live within the boundaries of society. His charm and intelligence, once seen as assets, became tools for manipulation and control. And while his early actions were small in scale, they set the stage for the choices that would define his life, and ultimately his death. The crimes. Scott Dozier's entry into the world of crime came through drug trafficking, a high-stakes business that promised both wealth and danger. Methamphetamine, a drug notorious for its addictive grip and devastating impact, became the cornerstone of his operation. Unlike the impulsive, reckless dealers who often fell prey to law enforcement, Scott approached the business like a strategist. He wasn't content to be a small-time player. He wanted control over the supply chain, the distribution networks, and the people involved. His charm and intelligence, traits that had once held promise in his youth, became tools of manipulation in his new life of crime. Operating primarily in Nevada and Arizona, Dozier built a network of suppliers, couriers, and enforcers. He understood that success in the drug trade required more than just product. It required loyalty, fear, and precision. He meticulously planned every detail of his operation, from the routes his couriers used to the methods for laundering the profits. Those who worked under him described a leader who was both charismatic and ruthless, someone who inspired confidence but would not hesitate to cut ties, or worse, if he sensed betrayal. As his empire grew, so did the risks. Dozier's business wasn't just about selling drugs, it was about maintaining power in a world where violence was the ultimate currency. Rival dealers, informants, and even former allies became threats that had to be neutralized. Scott didn't see violence as a last resort. It was a tool, one he wielded with cold calculation. This willingness to cross moral and legal lines without hesitation set him apart and made him a dangerous figure in the criminal underworld. One of Dozier's most notorious acts was the murder of Jeremiah Miller, a fellow drug dealer who became entangled in his web of control and paranoia. Miller, like many in the drug trade, was looking to make a quick profit. He traveled to Las Vegas in 2002 to meet Dozier under the pretense of purchasing materials for a methamphetamine operation. What Miller didn't know was that the meeting was a setup designed not to conduct business, but to end his life. Dozier lured Miller to a room at La Concha Motel, a now defunct establishment known for its affordability and anonymity. The plan was as brutal as it was calculated. Whether out of paranoia that Miller posed a threat, or simply out of greed to eliminate a competitor and take his money, Scott saw no other option but to kill him. Miller was murdered in the motel room, his death both sudden and violent. What followed was an act of chilling pragmatism. To dispose of the body, Dozier dismembered Miller's remains, placing some of them in a suitcase that he later abandoned near an apartment complex. The suitcase, discovered by a passerby, exposed the gruesome extent of the crime. Inside were Miller's torso and other remains, wrapped in plastic and discarded as if they were merely trash. This horrifying discovery set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to Dozier's downfall. The investigation into Miller's murder was relentless. Law enforcement quickly identified Dozier as a suspect thanks to witness testimonies and forensic evidence. Associates who had once worked alongside him began to cooperate with authorities, offering details about his operations and his role in Miller's death. The evidence painted a damning picture of a man who operated with precision and without remorse, someone who viewed human lives as expendable in the pursuit of his goals. But Miller wasn't the only victim linked to Scott Dozier. Investigators also suspected him in the disappearance and murder of Jason Griffin Green, another associate from Arizona who vanished under suspicious circumstances. Like Miller, Green was involved in the drug trade, and his ties to Dozier made him a likely target. Although Dozier was never formally charged in Green's case, the parallels between the two incidents added to the narrative of a man who used murder as a means to consolidate power and eliminate threats. The trial for Miller's murder was a spectacle in its own right, drawing attention from both the media and the public. Prosecutors presented a wealth of evidence, including forensic links to the crime scene, testimonies from former associates, and the gruesome details of how Miller's body had been discarded. Dozier's calm demeanor throughout the proceedings was both unsettling and revealing. He didn't flinch at the accusations or the graphic evidence presented against him. Instead, he appeared almost detached, as if he had already come to terms with his fate. The jury had little difficulty reaching a verdict. Scott Dozier was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Yet, even in the face of this ultimate punishment, he refused to follow the script. Most death row inmates spend years, even decades, filing appeals and fighting to delay their executions. Dozier did the opposite. He waived his appeals and demanded that his sentence be carried out as soon as possible. For him, the idea of spending his life in the limbo of death row was unbearable. He saw death not as a punishment, but as an escape, a final act of control in a life defined by defiance. Execution controversy. Scott Dozier's story took an unexpected turn when he made an extraordinary request, one that shocked the public, baffled the legal system, and left a permanent mark on the debate surrounding capital punishment in America. Unlike most death row inmates who fight tooth and nail to delay their sentences, Dozier stood apart. He actively demanded his own execution. To him, the limbo of waiting on death row was worse than death itself. His request set off a ripple effect, igniting a series of controversies that pitted him against the very machinery designed to end his life. At the heart of the conflict lay not just his demand, but the means to carry it out. Nevada, unprepared to handle such an unusual case, struggled to craft a solution amidst mounting legal and ethical challenges. What followed was a drama that transcended the walls of the prison and forced the country to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and the mechanics of death. At the core of the controversy was Nevada's proposed use of an experimental lethal injection cocktail. The state intended to combine midazolam, a sedative, fentanyl, a powerful opioid, and cisatracurium, a paralytic agent. It was an untested combination, one with no guarantee of ensuring a quick or painless death. Critics immediately pointed out the risks. Midazolam had a history of botched executions, and the paralytic could mask signs of suffering, raising concerns about cruel and unusual punishment. Pharmaceutical companies quickly entered the fray. Manufacturers of the drugs slated for Dozier's execution argued that their products were never intended for such use and launched lawsuits to prevent their involvement. They feared the public backlash that could arise from their association with executions, especially one as contentious as this. These legal battles ground the process to a halt, much to Dozier's frustration. He had made his decision. He wanted to die, yet the very system tasked with carrying out that wish seemed incapable of delivering. As the legal and ethical debates raged on, the public became increasingly captivated by the case. Media outlets from across the country descended on Nevada, turning Dozier into an unlikely symbol of defiance. His calm and unapologetic demeanor during interviews only added fuel to the fire. Here was a man convicted of unspeakable crimes, yet he spoke with a rationality and resolve that unnerved even his critics. His case reignited the long-smoldering debate about the death penalty in the United States. The delays in Dozier's execution only intensified the spotlight. His execution was scheduled, postponed, rescheduled, and delayed again, each time due to ongoing legal battles over the drug protocol. For Dozier, the waiting was a punishment in itself. He publicly stated that he would rather die than endure the monotony and isolation of death row. "Life in a cage," he once said, is not life at all. His frustration grew with each passing day, and his mental state became a focal point for both supporters and critics of the death penalty. The psychological toll of waiting was undeniable. Dozier's letters and interviews painted the picture of a man caught in limbo, desperate for an end. Yet even in his desperation, there was a chilling clarity. He seemed to understand the system better than those tasked with managing it. He knew the weaknesses, the flaws, and the bureaucratic red tape that would inevitably come into play. His defiance wasn't just against the delays, it was against the system itself. As the legal battles dragged on, one question loomed large. What drove Scott Dozier to demand his own execution? Was it simply an escape from the grim realities of death row, or was it a deeper act of rebellion, a way to assert control in a system designed to strip it away? Some saw his determination as a form of protest, a way to expose the inefficiencies and hypocrisies of the justice system. Others viewed it as the final act of a man who had spent his life defying the rules. The final 24 hours. Scott Dozier's last day, January 5, 2019, was a mixture of calm acceptance and tense anticipation. It marked the end of a complicated journey for a man who had spent years declaring he preferred death over the uncertainty of death row. His final hours were as deliberate and calculated as the life he had lived. Dozier started his day in his solitary cell at Ely State Prison in Nevada. By 6 a.m., the routine of prison life began. But for Dozier, this morning was different. He had made it clear in the past that he did not fear death. His calm demeanor that day reflected this. He showed no signs of panic or regret, behaving as though he was entirely at peace with what was to come. Instead of focusing on himself, Dozier spent his final hours writing letters to loved ones. These letters were steady and clear, without desperation or fear. His words reflected his personality, methodical and composed. He didn't request a special last meal or any privileges, choosing instead to stick to the ordinary, avoiding any theatrics. While Dozier seemed calm, the atmosphere in the prison was the opposite. Guards moved with nervous energy, aware of the attention surrounding his case. Fellow inmates were abuzz with curiosity and unease. Some admired Dozier's defiance, while others questioned his motives. The guards knew that every decision they made that day would be scrutinized, and this added to the tension. By noon, preparations for Dozier's scheduled execution were underway. Every step of the process was documented meticulously, a reminder of the strict procedures that governed such events. Guards who interacted with Dozier described him as polite but distant, speaking little and showing no signs of fear. His composed behavior made even the most seasoned staff uneasy. At 1 p.m., Dozier sat quietly in his cell, reflecting on his decision. Over the years, he had stated many times that he would rather die than continue living on death row. He viewed his execution as a way out, not as a punishment. His calm demeanor that day seemed to confirm that he had made peace with his choice. However, his actions in the coming hours would show that he was still in full control of his fate. Dozier spent part of the afternoon responding to letters and reading messages from supporters. There were no emotional outbursts or dramatic goodbyes. He accepted his reality with a quiet determination that left those around him unsettled. At around 5:30 p.m., everything changed. In a stunning twist, Scott Dozier took his own life, hanging himself in his cell using a bedsheet. His decision appeared calculated, ensuring that he died on his own terms rather than waiting for the state to execute him. Guards discovered his body shortly afterward during a routine check. The news of his death spread quickly through the prison, leaving staff and inmates in shock. The discovery of Dozier's body sent the prison into chaos. Guards, accustomed to managing difficult situations, were visibly shaken. An immediate investigation was launched to determine how Dozier had managed to kill himself despite being under heightened watch. Fellow inmates gossiped among themselves, speculating on how he had pulled it off and what it meant for the rest of them. The usually strict order of prison life gave way to confusion and disarray. News of Dozier's suicide broke within hours, sparking debates across the country. His death reignited discussions about the death penalty, mental health, and the psychological toll of life on death row. Supporters of capital punishment pointed to the delays in his execution as proof of a flawed system, while opponents argued that his death highlighted the inhumanity of prolonged incarceration and the ethical challenges of a state-sanctioned death. Within the prison system, Dozier's death triggered a review of protocols. Staff were questioned about how such a high-profile inmate had managed to end his life while under close observation. Some saw his suicide as a failure of the system, while others believed it was the inevitable outcome of a man determined to control his destiny. Dozier's actions left behind many unanswered questions. Why did he choose to end his life that day? Was it a protest, a way to maintain control, or simply the result of years of frustration and despair? His decision forced the nation to confront the uncomfortable realities of the death penalty and its impact on both inmates and the justice system as a whole. For the staff at Ely State Prison, the events of January 4th, 2019 served as a stark reminder of the complexities of working within the justice system. By taking control of his own fate, Dozier ensured that his story would remain a pivotal moment in the ongoing discussion about capital punishment. William Bonin, the freeway killer, met his end strapped to a gurney in San Quentin, unrepentant to his last breath. But before his final moments, he turned Southern California's freeways into a dumping ground for his young victims. Using his van as a mobile chamber of horrors, Bonin lured boys into a nightmare of torture and murder. How did one man orchestrate such terror, and what drove him to such depravity? Early life. Born on January 8, 1947, in the small industrial town of Willimantic, Connecticut, Bonin's early years were marked by relentless hardship. He was the middle child in a family plagued by dysfunction, and his home life quickly became a battleground of unmet needs and unchecked anger. His father, a raging alcoholic and compulsive gambler, was frequently absent. When he was present, he brought with him a volatile temper, inflicting both verbal and physical abuse on his children. Bonin's mother, burdened by her husband's erratic behavior and the family's financial instability, seemed incapable of providing the nurturing environment young William desperately needed. Often, she would leave him and his brothers in the care of their grandfather, a man later revealed to be a predator who subjected Bonin to horrific sexual abuse. These formative years planted the seeds of mistrust and rage that would define Bonin's path in life. Despite the chaos, young William attempted to fit in, but the scars of his home life were already showing. Teachers noted his withdrawal and disinterest in school. Neighbors described him as quiet but unnervingly distant, as if he were carrying a weight too heavy for a child to bear. By the age of 10, Bonin had already begun showing signs of antisocial tendencies. Petty theft and vandalism became common activities, and he displayed a disturbing lack of empathy for others. These behaviors, though concerning, went largely unchecked by his family and the community around him. In school, Bonin struggled both academically and socially. His grades were poor, and his interactions with peers were often fraught with tension. Teachers described him as a disruptive presence, while classmates avoided him due to his unpredictable nature. These struggles only deepened his sense of isolation, further pushing him toward a life of deviance. By his late teens, Bonin's actions had escalated beyond mischief. Reports of his involvement in violent altercations began to surface, and his run-ins with local law enforcement became more frequent. Yet, for all his growing notoriety, no one could predict the extent of the horrors he would later commit. In 1965, seeking an escape from his troubled past, Bonin enlisted in the United States Air Force. For a brief period, military life provided him with structure and purpose. He trained as a radar operator and was stationed in Vietnam during the height of the war. However, the Air Force would also become a source for his darker impulses. While serving overseas, Bonin reportedly began engaging in acts of sexual violence against fellow soldiers. These crimes, though disturbing, were rarely reported or investigated during the chaos of wartime. Bonin's military career ended abruptly in 1969 when he was dishonorably discharged following accusations of sexual misconduct. This expulsion marked a turning point in his life. Stripped of the order and discipline the military had provided, Bonin returned to civilian life, now burdened with new layers of trauma and anger. Bonin's return to civilian life was anything but smooth. Now back in the United States, he struggled to reintegrate into society. Unable to hold down steady employment and with no meaningful connections to family or friends, Bonin found himself increasingly isolated. This isolation, combined with his long-standing psychological issues, set the stage for his descent into serious criminal behavior. The crimes. By the early 1970s, Bonin had begun committing acts of sexual assault against young boys. His crimes were characterized by a chilling level of premeditation and violence, as he often targeted vulnerable children from broken homes, mirroring his own troubled upbringing. These assaults led to his first significant encounter with the justice system in 1974. When he was arrested and convicted of sexually assaulting 5 boys. Sentenced to serve time in prison, Bonin would use this period to refine, rather than suppress, his criminal tendencies. Prison psychologists later noted his manipulative charm and complete lack of remorse. It was during this time that Bonin reportedly expressed fantasies of inflicting greater harm, fantasies he would act on shortly after his release. By the time Bonin was released from prison in the late 1970s, the foundations of his future crimes were firmly in place. The combination of his unresolved trauma, lack of remorse, and growing confidence in his ability to evade detection made him a ticking time bomb. In the years that followed, Bonin's crimes would escalate to unimaginable levels of brutality. But even as his reign of terror began, traces of his troubled past lingered in his methods and choice of victims. It was as if he was inflicting his own pain onto the world, one horrifying act at a time. Southern California in the late 1970s was a region living under the shadow of fear. Young boys and teenagers were disappearing, and their bodies were surfacing days later in desolate locations, brutalized, discarded, and unrecognizable to all but their grieving families. The pattern was chilling, and the press was quick to coin a name for the perpetrator, the freeway killer. For many, the nickname captured the scale of terror this individual unleashed, but for law enforcement, it marked the beginning of a relentless hunt. At the center of this chaos was William Bonin, a man whose crimes would become synonymous with unfathomable cruelty. The killings were calculated and gruesome. Bonin had a method to his madness, carefully selecting his victims and turning each encounter into a horrifying ritual. As police pieced together the details, it became clear that Bonin was no ordinary predator. His ability to evade capture while increasing his brutality suggested a killer who thrived on the thrill of his own evil. William Bonin's crimes were as systematic as they were horrifying. He preyed on the vulnerable, specifically targeting teenage boys and young men. Many of his victims were hitchhikers, runaways, or boys from difficult home lives, individuals less likely to be reported missing immediately. These boys often fell victim to Bonin's manipulative charm, unaware they were stepping into the van of a sadistic murderer. Bonin's infamous van became another disturbing symbol of his crimes. Outfitted with tools of restraint, including rope and handcuffs, the vehicle doubled as both a trap and a mobile torture chamber. Once a victim entered, the doors locked not just physically, but metaphorically, sealing their fate. The van allowed Bonin to operate in secluded areas while still remaining mobile, a factor that helped him evade capture for so long. Bonin's methods of murder were as cruel as they were deliberate. He would often gain his victims' trust before overpowering them with sheer force. The torture that followed was methodical, involving ligatures, knives, and blunt objects. Bonin seemed to revel in the suffering he inflicted, demonstrating a complete lack of empathy. After the murders, the bodies were dumped along freeways, a move that both terrorized the public and served as Bonin's grim signature. With each killing, Bonin's methods grew more calculated and brutal. Early victims suffered strangulation, but later victims were subjected to prolonged torture. Authorities began noticing unique details, such as the use of ligatures fashioned from ropes or shoelaces. These elements, while horrifying, offered law enforcement critical clues about the identity and mindset of the killer. Bonin's actions weren't just about satisfying his twisted urges, they were also a taunt to law enforcement. The decision to leave bodies in highly visible locations along freeways was a deliberate move, signaling his arrogance and confidence in his ability to evade capture. While William Bonin is often the focus of discussions about the freeway killer, it's crucial to remember the lives lost to his violence. Each victim was more than just a statistic. They were sons, brothers, and friends whose lives were cut tragically short. Bonin's victims were primarily boys between the ages of 12 and 19, many of whom came from difficult circumstances. For instance, 13-year-old Thomas Lundgren had dreams of becoming a mechanic before he was lured into Bonin's van. Similarly, 17-year-old Michael McDonald had a close-knit group of friends who described him as loyal and outgoing. These were young lives full of potential, stolen by a man driven by his own demons. The first challenge for investigators was identifying the connection between the murders. Bonin's victims came from diverse backgrounds, but there were striking similarities in the cases. The victims, typically boys aged 12 to 19, were often found bound, strangled, or bludgeoned. The use of ligatures, evidence of sexual assault, and the locations where bodies were discarded all hinted at a single perpetrator, or possibly a group. Still, the investigation faced hurdles. Forensic technology in the 1970s was far less advanced than it is today, leaving detectives reliant on physical evidence and witness accounts. The lack of a centralized database for tracking serial offenders also slowed progress. Each crime seemed isolated at first glance, and it took time before detectives realized they were hunting the same predator. As more bodies were discovered, the media played a pivotal role in amplifying public panic. Headlines about the freeway killer dominated newspapers and television broadcasts, painting a dark picture of a predator who could strike at any time. This constant coverage pressured law enforcement to deliver results quickly, but it also had unintended consequences. The media's attention emboldened Bonin, who seemed to revel in the fear his crimes created. At the same time, the intense scrutiny made the investigation more challenging, as tips flooded in from concerned citizens and conspiracy theories began circulating. Bonin didn't operate alone. Over time, he recruited several accomplices, including Vernon Butts, a factory worker and part-time magician, and James Monroe, a drifter seeking a sense of belonging, as well as Gregory Miley. These individuals not only helped Bonin secure victims, but also participated in or witnessed the atrocities. Bonin's ability to manipulate these accomplices showcased his disturbing charisma and power over those around him. But their involvement would later prove crucial in his downfall, as their confessions gave investigators the break they desperately needed. But individuals he manipulated into compliance. Vernon Butts, for instance, was a factory worker with a fascination for the macabre, and James Monroe was a drifter seeking connection. Bonin's ability to control these men showcased his disturbing charisma and predatory instincts, allowing him to spread his reign of terror further than he could have alone. As the investigation intensified, cracks began forming in Bonin's circle. Accomplices who initially supported him began to break under pressure, Vernon Butts, in particular, provided chilling details about Bonin's methods, describing how he would charm his victims before turning on them with unimaginable cruelty. These testimonies were instrumental in building a case against Bonin, offering insight into his actions and mindset. The relationships between Bonin and his accomplices were far from stable. Tensions arose as the crimes escalated, with some accomplices fearing for their safety. This internal discord sowed the seeds of betrayal that would eventually lead to Bonin's capture. For months, Bonin operated with disturbing precision, but like many serial killers, his overconfidence became his downfall. The murder of Stephen Wells, a 19-year-old who entered Bonin's van in 1980, marked the beginning of the end. This time, Bonin's accomplices played a crucial role in his capture. James Monroe, who was present during Wells' murder, later confided in a friend about the crime. The friend contacted the police, setting off a chain of events that would bring Bonin's spree to a close. Armed with this tip, law enforcement began closely monitoring Bonin. Detectives set up surveillance on his van, which had become synonymous with his crimes. On June 11, 1980, Bonin was caught in the act, attempting to assault another young boy. This time, there would be no escape. The police arrested him on the spot, ending his reign of terror. Bonin's demeanor during his arrest was disturbingly calm. According to officers, he showed little emotion, even as the evidence against him mounted. In his van, detectives found handcuffs, rope, and other items linking him to the murders. It was clear they had finally caught the freeway killer. With Bonin in custody, the true extent of his atrocities began to emerge. He was linked to at least 21 murders, though authorities suspected the number could be higher. The sheer brutality of his crimes shocked the nation and brought renewed attention to the vulnerabilities of runaway and hitchhiking youth. Bonin's crimes also had a lasting impact on society. The dangers of hitchhiking became a national conversation, leading to campaigns urging young people to avoid accepting rides from strangers. Law enforcement agencies also began developing more sophisticated methods for tracking serial offenders, laying the groundwork for future investigations. The trial. William Bonin's trial was nothing short of a spectacle, filled with moments that left even seasoned courtroom observers shaken. Prosecutors aimed to showcase the premeditation and sheer brutality of Bonin's crimes. They highlighted his calculated methods, lack of remorse, and the overwhelming evidence tying him to the murders. The goal was to present Bonin as an unrepentant predator, ensuring a conviction and the harshest possible sentence. Bonin's defense team attempted to paint a more complex picture, suggesting mental instability and a traumatic upbringing as mitigating factors. While they did not deny his involvement in the murders, they sought to humanize him in the hopes of sparing him the death penalty. However, this approach was met with skepticism, given the overwhelming evidence and Bonin's chilling demeanor. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Bonin as a cold-blooded killer, describing his crimes in graphic detail. The defense countered with pleas for understanding, citing Bonin's troubled past as a factor in his actions. From the outset, the emotional weight of the case was palpable. The trial's most gut-wrenching moments came from the families of Bonin's victims. Parents and siblings took the stand, recounting the devastating impact of his crimes. Evidence presented during the trial included forensic findings, photographs, and the tools recovered from Bonin's van. Each piece further illuminated the calculated nature of his crimes. Perhaps most shocking were Bonin's own words. In recorded interviews with investigators, he described his crimes with a chilling lack of remorse. His confessions, delivered in a calm and matter-of-fact tone, highlighted the depth of his depravity. After weeks of harrowing testimony, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. The decision was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow from the victims' families. Justice had been served, but the loss of their loved ones remained an unhealed wound. During the sentencing phase, the court weighed the magnitude of Bonin's crimes. The decision to impose the death penalty reflected the severity of his actions and the lack of mitigating factors. But Bonin, true to form, showed little emotion as the sentence was read. For the families of the victims, the trial's outcome brought some measure of justice, but could never erase the pain of their losses. The broader public, meanwhile, expressed relief that Bonin would never again pose a threat. Bonin's time on death row was marked by a disturbing lack of remorse. While many inmates reflect or express regret for their crimes, Bonin seemed indifferent. Prison staff reported that he maintained an unsettling calmness, showing neither fear for his fate nor empathy for his victims. He occasionally granted interviews, during which his demeanor remained as cold and calculating as during his trial. In these moments, Bonin offered no insight into his motivations beyond what was already known: his need for control and his desire to inflict pain. Bonin's legal team filed multiple appeals in an attempt to delay his execution. These appeals, while a standard part of the process, were met with frustration and anger from the victims' families, who saw them as unnecessary prolongations of their pain. Each delay felt like a reopening of old wounds, dragging out their journey toward closure. Despite his isolation on death row, Bonin remained a figure of public fascination and revulsion. True crime enthusiasts, psychologists, and journalists speculated endlessly about what drove him to commit such heinous acts. At the same time, his case became a rallying point for debates on the death penalty, with advocates arguing for swift justice and opponents questioning its effectiveness. The last 24 hours. On February 22, 1996, William Bonin, last day began like any other for a death row inmate, but the weight of finality loomed heavy. Guards noted that he showed little outward emotion as the hours ticked by. For someone who had inflicted so much pain, Bonin's own end was surprisingly ordinary. He woke up at 6 a.m. in his prison cell. This was not just another day on death row, it was his last. The knowledge of his impending execution hung heavily in the air. The morning began unremarkably. Bonin's breakfast was as plain as any other inmate's: a slice of bread with too much jelly and a carton of milk. There were no special arrangements for him. He was treated like any other condemned prisoner. Despite the magnitude of his crimes, Bonin remained just another inmate awaiting his fate. By mid-morning, Bonin made a final attempt to make his voice heard. Instead of reaching out to family or loved ones, he used his allotted phone call to contact a radio station. He wanted to give an interview to Alex Bennett, a host known for his opposition to the death penalty. However, the call was cut short by prison officials before Bonin could say much. Inmates were not allowed live media interviews, and his attempt to speak publicly was swiftly shut down. Meanwhile, Bonin's lawyers scrambled to file last-minute appeals, arguing that he had been denied a fair trial due to poor legal representation and mishandling of evidence. However, these efforts were quickly dismissed by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Governor Pete Wilson, who had already rejected a clemency request, described Bonin as a symbol of why the death penalty existed. The courts found no reason to delay the execution, ruling that justice would not be compromised by carrying out the sentence. As the afternoon stretched on, Bonin spent time with his legal team, a chaplain, and a few visitors. Despite his situation, he appeared calm and collected, showing no signs of distress or fear. He passed the time reading letters from supporters, as if they provided a fleeting sense of normalcy in his final hours. There were no dramatic gestures or apologies. Bonin remained detached, much like he had throughout his trial and imprisonment. At 4:08 p.m., Bonin was granted a rare interview with a reporter from KQED-FM. His composure during the conversation was unsettling. When asked about his thoughts on facing death, Bonin admitted he had made peace with the possibility. However, when the subject of regret came up, his response was chillingly off-topic. Instead of expressing remorse for his victims, he lamented leaving the sport of bowling too soon. Bonin reminisced about his teenage years when he had excelled in the game and regretted not pursuing it further. When asked about the families of his victims, Bonin flatly stated that his death would not bring them peace. His cold words revealed an absence of empathy that had defined his life. As the evening approached, Bonin's final appeals were denied, sealing his fate. Around 7:30 p.m., he sat down for his last meal, a feast of 2 large pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and 3 six-packs of Coca-Cola. The indulgence contrasted starkly with the somber reality of the hours ahead. While he ate, outside the prison, the execution had reignited debates about the death penalty, with passionate opinions on both sides. Some lit candles in quiet protest, while others called for justice for Bonin's victims. After finishing his meal, Bonin was escorted from his holding cell to a nearby death watch cell, located just steps from the execution chamber. Here, guards performed a final body search to ensure he had no contraband. The atmosphere inside the prison was tense, as everyone involved prepared for what was to come. Shortly before midnight, Bonin was led to the execution chamber. He walked calmly, showing no outward signs of fear or regret. Witnesses included his attorney, a chaplain, and a few others he had chosen to be present. Some of the victims' families also attended, hoping that witnessing his death might bring a sense of closure. Once inside, Bonin was strapped to a gurney. His expression remained stoic as guards placed intravenous lines in his arms. The execution process began at 12:09 a.m. on February 23, 1996. The first drug, sodium pentothal, rendered him unconscious within seconds. Next, pancuronium bromide was administered to paralyze his muscles and stop his breathing. Finally, potassium chloride was injected to halt his heart. The entire procedure took just a few minutes, and at 12:13 a.m., William Bonin was pronounced dead. Bonin left no grand final statement, only a brief message to the prison warden expressing his belief that the death penalty sent the wrong message to society. His words, however, lacked the remorse many had hoped for. Outside the prison, the reactions were as divided as they had been throughout his case. For the families of his victims, Bonin's execution was a long-awaited moment, though it could never truly erase the pain he had caused. For opponents of the death penalty, it was another instance of state-sanctioned violence. Bonin was the first person in California to be executed by lethal injection. His death raised questions about justice, redemption, and the value of closure for the families affected by his crimes. In his final moments, he showed no remorse, leaving behind only a chilling reminder of the darkness he had brought into the world. For many, his execution was not just about punishing a criminal, it was about ending a nightmare. Ted Bundy escaped from police custody not once, but twice, coming dangerously close to disappearing forever. In court, he didn't just stand trial, he defended himself, a spectacle never before seen from a serial killer. His charm, intelligence, and audacity captivated the nation and even his victims, but it was his own recklessness that ultimately sealed his fate. Early years. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. From the very beginning, his life was full of secrecy. His mother, Eleanor Cowell, gave birth to him out of wedlock, a fact considered scandalous and a taboo at that time in the 1940s. To avoid social stigma, Ted was raised by his grandparents, who posed as his parents. For much of his early childhood, Bundy believed that his mother was his older sister, a lie that would later unravel and leave a lasting impact. Bundy's grandfather was reportedly a violent and controlling figure, while his grandmother struggled with mental health issues. In this environment, young Ted displayed signs of emotional detachment and a growing fascination with control. When Eleanor eventually revealed the truth about their relationship, it shook Bundy to his core, creating a foundation of insecurity and anger that would haunt him for years. After moving to Tacoma, Washington, with his mother and her new husband, Ted continued to feel out of place. As Bundy grew older, his intelligence and charisma became evident. He was articulate and well-read, traits that often masked his inability to form meaningful connections. While many viewed him as an awkward but promising young man, those closer to him noticed troubling behaviors. Bundy's ambition led him to the University of Puget Sound before transferring to the University of Washington, where he studied psychology. It was during this time that he began to master the art of manipulation, learning to present himself as a likable and trustworthy individual. His professors and peers described him as intelligent and driven, though some noted a lack of genuine warmth in his interactions. As Bundy entered adulthood, his fascination with control took a darker turn. He became fixated on violent pornography, a medium that seemed to fuel his emerging fantasies. He also began experimenting with manipulation, testing his ability to deceive and control others around him, as well as strangers. Bundy's charm and intelligence allowed him to gain trust effortlessly, even as his intentions grew more sinister. A pivotal moment in Bundy's life was his relationship with Stephanie Brooks, a beautiful and affluent woman who represented everything he aspired to but felt he could never truly attain. When Stephanie ended their relationship, Bundy was devastated. Her rejection became an obsession, driving him to reinvent himself in an attempt to win her back. He began dressing better, working on his charm, and cultivating a more confident demeanor. This facade eventually worked, and the two briefly rekindled their relationship, but he ended it abruptly, perhaps as a way to reclaim the power he felt she had taken from him. Bundy's frustrations with his professional and personal life also played a role. Despite his outward confidence, He often felt inadequate compared to his peers. These insecurities, combined with possible psychological issues such as psychopathy or narcissistic traits, fueled his need to dominate others. The crimes. Ted Bundy didn't just stalk his victims, he was a master in manipulation, turning trust into a deadly trap. His ability to blend into society made him one of the most chilling predators in history. What made Bundy so dangerous wasn't just his brutality, but the way he turned human trust into his deadliest weapon. He often used props like slings, crutches, or casts to feign injury, presenting himself as vulnerable and in need of help. This tactic preyed on the kindness of his victims, who felt safe assisting a seemingly harmless man. In one of his most dangerous acts, Bundy pretended to struggle with loading a sailboat onto his car, asking a young woman for help. Her willingness to assist sealed her fate. Bundy's calm demeanor and polite nature masked his true intentions, allowing him to lead his victims into isolation. He often approached women in public places like college campuses, parking lots, and beaches, spaces where his charm and good looks put them at ease. Each encounter was meticulously planned, his confidence hiding the violence that was only moments away. Before he began abducting women, Bundy's criminal behavior started with voyeurism and stalking. Peering into windows and observing women from a distance gave him a sense of control and power, an early precursor to his later crimes. Over time, Bundy escalated, moving from distant observation to direct confrontation. He would select his victims carefully, often targeting women who resembled his ex-girlfriend Stephanie Brooks. Many were young brunettes with long hair parted down the middle, a haunting reflection of his unresolved obsession with her. Bundy's approach evolved as well, moving from simply observing potential victims to physically abducting them. He would use his charm to gain trust, then overpower them once they were isolated. Parking lots, secluded walkways, and dark streets became his hunting grounds, each location chosen for its vulnerability. Ted Bundy's crimes spanned multiple states, including Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, leaving a trail of fear in his wake. His signature methods, blunt force trauma, strangulation, and post-mortem rituals, exposed the depths of his depravity. Bundy often used objects like crowbars to render his victims unconscious before strangling them. Some of his victims were subjected to unspeakable acts even after death, as Bundy returned to the crime scenes to exert control over their lifeless bodies. The Chi Omega murders in Florida marked a turning point in Bundy's spree. Breaking into a sorority house, he attacked 4 women in a frenzy of violence, killing 2 and severely injuring 2 others. The brutality of these murders shocked the nation, cementing Bundy's reputation as one of history's most terrifying serial killers. Bundy's charisma extended beyond his victims. He manipulated the media and public with alarming ease. His clean-cut appearance and articulate speech led many to believe he was incapable of such horrors. Women who interacted with him described feeling at ease, even charmed by his presence. This manipulation was a calculated attempt to control the narrative, making the world doubt the truth of his crimes. Survivors who escaped Bundy's clutches described a terrifying transformation. In one moment, he was polite and charming. In the next, his eyes would go cold, and his demeanor would become predatory. These accounts revealed Bundy's ability to switch between personas, a chilling skill that made him so effective as a predator. Amid the horror of Bundy's crimes, it's essential to remember the lives lost and the communities shattered by his actions. His victims were daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives were cruelly stolen. Some survivors, like Carol Duranch, managed to escape and later played crucial roles in bringing Bundy to justice. Their bravery in recounting their harrowing experiences helped to expose Bundy for the monster he was. The trial. With the world watching, Bundy transformed his trials into a performance. What should have been somber legal proceedings turned into a spectacle, captivating audiences across the country. From his decision to represent himself to the unprecedented media attention, Bundy used every moment to shape his image and maintain control, even as the evidence against him painted a disturbing picture of his guilt. Ted Bundy's decision to represent himself remains one of the most controversial aspects of his trials. For Bundy, this wasn't a last resort, it was an opportunity to assert dominance and showcase his intelligence. Despite being a law student rather than an attorney, Bundy believed he could outwit the legal system. His overconfidence turned the trial into a stage for his egotism, with Bundy pacing the courtroom, questioning witnesses, and even his own victims while addressing the jury as though he were the star of the show. There were moments when Bundy's legal knowledge impressed the court, demonstrating his intelligence and ability to navigate complex proceedings. However, his arrogance often undermined his efforts. Bundy's need to control every aspect of his trial led to missteps that ultimately weakened his defense. His theatrics, while captivating to some, revealed his inability to see the reality of his situation. He was facing overwhelming evidence, yet he continued to act as though charm alone could save him. The media frenzy surrounding Bundy's trials was unprecedented, marking the first time a serial killer's courtroom proceedings were broadcast nationwide. Bundy wasn't just aware of the cameras, he relished them. For many viewers, his demeanor created an unsettling disconnect between the man they saw on screen and the monster described in testimony. The media's coverage of Bundy humanized him in ways that both baffled and disturbed the public. Some saw him as a misunderstood figure, his articulate speech and clean-cut appearance casting doubt on his guilt. Others were drawn to the sheer spectacle of it all. This disturbing dynamic revealed Bundy's mastery of psychological manipulation. Despite the horrific evidence presented, he managed to maintain a veneer of likability. One of the most bizarre moments in Bundy's trials came when he proposed to Carol Ann Boone in court. Boone, a former co-worker who maintained Bundy's innocence throughout the proceedings, was testifying in his defense when Bundy exploited a legal loophole to marry her on the spot. Boone's unwavering support of Bundy baffled many, but it just further proved his manipulative tendencies. Even as he faced overwhelming evidence, Bundy convinced Boone of his innocence, using their relationship to further his image as a misunderstood victim. The verdict and sentencing marked the end of Bundy's courtroom theatrics, but revealed cracks in his carefully maintained facade. When the guilty verdict was delivered, Bundy's attempts to appear calm and composed faltered. His charm, which had carried him through much of the trial, couldn't shield him from the weight of the evidence or the reality of his fate. During sentencing, Judge Edward Cowart delivered remarks that captured the bizarre duality of Bundy's character. While condemning him to death, Cowart acknowledged Bundy's intelligence and potential, famously stating, "You'd have made a good lawyer. I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me, but you went the wrong way, partner." These words highlighted the tragedy of Bundy's wasted potential, a sharp contrast to the horrific nature of his crimes. As Bundy's death sentence was pronounced, the mask he had worn for so long began to slip. The controlled, confident image he had cultivated gave way to glimpses of the predator beneath. For the families of his victims, it was a moment of justice, though the pain of their loss could never be erased. Escape attempts. In June 1977, Bundy faced trial in Aspen, Colorado, for the murder of Corinne Campbell. While Bundy's charm had often allowed him to manipulate those around him, it was his keen observation that provided an opportunity for escape. At the Pitkin County Courthouse, Bundy noticed a critical security flaw. He was often left unshackled during proceedings. Bundy requested access to the courthouse library to prepare his defense, a privilege granted to him as his own attorney. Seizing the moment, Bundy used the guise of research to execute his plan. With no guards present, he opened a second-story window and jumped. The fall injured his ankle, but Bundy's determination drove him to limp into the wilderness, evading capture. The manhunt that followed was chaotic, with authorities scrambling to locate the fugitive. For 6 days, Bundy roamed the mountains, surviving on stolen food and sheer willpower. His brief taste of freedom ended when he was found near Aspen, disheveled and hungry. Though recaptured, Bundy's escape had humiliated law enforcement, and he would soon use this to his advantage. Bundy's second escape was even more daring and meticulously planned. Transferred to the Glenwood Springs jail, Bundy found himself in a more secure facility. But as evidence against him mounted, his desperation grew. Over several weeks, Bundy devised a plan that showcased his intelligence and determination. Bundy began dieting to lose weight, allowing him to fit through a small hole in the ceiling of his cell. He studied the jail's layout, learning the ductwork system and identifying the perfect night to make his move. On December 30th, 1977, while other inmates celebrated New Year's Eve early, Bundy executed his escape. Climbing through the ceiling, he navigated the ductwork and emerged in the apartment of a jailer who was out for the evening. Calm and calculated, Bundy changed clothes and walked out of the jail as if he belonged. It wasn't until hours later that authorities realized he was gone. By then, Bundy had vanished, using stolen cars and a fake ID to make his way across the country. Bundy's time on the run was a chilling reminder of his capacity for violence. Fleeing to Florida, he adopted a new identity and tried to blend into society. But the darkness that drove him couldn't be suppressed. On January 15, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What followed was a brutal attack that left 2 women dead and 2 others severely injured. The ferocity of the murder shocked the nation, further solidifying Bundy's infamy. Just weeks later, Bundy abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, his youngest and final known victim. His recklessness during this period revealed a man unraveling, driven by his compulsions, but losing the calculated control that had defined his earlier crimes. The spree came to an end in February 1978, when Bundy was stopped by police in Pensacola. Using a fake ID, he initially tried to talk his way out of trouble, but his stolen car and suspicious behavior gave him away. The car, a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle, matched descriptions linked to recent crimes. When the officer pulled Bundy over, he attempted to use a fake ID, but his nervous demeanor gave him away. After a brief struggle, Bundy was arrested and taken into custody. Bundy's escape attempts were more than acts of desperation. They were a window into his psyche. A man obsessed with control, Bundy refused to be confined by the rules of others. His confidence and his intelligence fueled his belief that he could outsmart anyone, from guards to seasoned detectives. His escape also had a profound impact, not just on his story, but on the criminal justice system itself. They exposed glaring weaknesses in security and highlighted the dangers of underestimating high-profile prisoners. In the wake of Bundy's escapes, jails and courthouses across the country implemented stricter protocols, ensuring that no one else could exploit similar vulnerabilities. The last 24 hours. Ted Bundy woke early on January 23, 1989, knowing this day would be unlike any other. For years, his small cell on death row at Florida State Prison had been his reality, but now it felt more like a tomb. Every passing moment brought him closer to the fate he had avoided for so long. The morning started at 6 a.m. with a simple cup of coffee, the routine task offering little comfort in the face of what lay ahead. By 8 a.m., Bundy's legal team, led by Polly Nelson and Jim Coleman, worked frantically to file last-minute appeals. They argued that Bundy was mentally incompetent to be executed, hoping to delay the inevitable. However, the courts were unyielding. Bundy, who had once thrived on controlling legal proceedings as his own attorney, now found himself powerless. Each rejection tightened the noose around him, figuratively and literally. By noon, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal, effectively sealing his fate. With less than 24 hours to live, Bundy was left to reflect on the choices that had led him to this moment. For a man who had evaded accountability for so long, the clock was now ticking louder than ever. Around 1 p.m., Bundy's mother, Louise, visited him one last time. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Louise had clung to the belief that her son was innocent. Their meeting was short but heavy with emotion. There were no dramatic farewells, just a quiet acknowledgement of the reality they both faced. As Louise left the prison, she broke down in tears, her strength finally crumbling under the weight of Bundy's actions and his impending death. Later that afternoon, Bundy met with his spiritual advisor, Fred Lawrence. In his final years, Bundy had turned to religion, perhaps seeking redemption or peace. The details of their conversation remained private, but the gravity of the moment was undeniable. Was Bundy genuinely seeking forgiveness, or was this another performance in a life defined by manipulation? By 5 p.m., Bundy agreed to a televised interview with James Dobson, a prominent evangelical Christian. It was Bundy's last chance to speak publicly, and he used it to blame his violent behavior on an addiction to pornography. He claimed that exposure to explicit material had fueled his impulses, but many doubted the sincerity of his words. At 6 p.m., Bundy was offered his last meal. Unlike some death row inmates who request elaborate feasts, Bundy declined to make any special requests. Instead, he was served the standard final meal: steak cooked medium rare, eggs over easy, toast with butter and jelly, milk, and juice. However, he barely touched the food. Whether due to anxiety, fear, or loss of appetite, the reason remains unclear. As night fell, the atmosphere around Florida State Prison grew tense. Outside, a large crowd gathered. Protesters stood alongside supporters, their chants creating an eerie soundtrack to the night. Signs calling for justice mingled with those condemning the death penalty. Inside the prison, Bundy met one last time with his attorney, Polly Nelson, and the prison chaplain. Nelson later described Bundy as panicked, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of his approaching execution. Sleep eluded Bundy as the night stretched on. By 1 a.m., he had been offered medication to help him rest, but it's unclear if he accepted. The sounds of the prison, the clanking of cell doors, muffled voices of guards, and occasional chants from the crowd outside served as a grim reminder of what was coming. At 6 a.m. on January 24th, Bundy was awakened for the last time. He was given time to shower and change into clean clothes, following standard protocol. Guards carried out their duties with quiet precision, knowing the gravity of the task at hand. Bundy's demeanor was described as nervous but composed, as though he was determined to maintain control in his final moments. At 6:30 a.m., prison officials arrived to escort Bundy to the execution chamber. The walk was short, but each step carried immense weight. Flanked by guards, Bundy moved through the narrow corridors, his composure masking the fear that witnesses later said was evident in his eyes. This was a man who had once bragged about being the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'd ever meet, now facing the ultimate reckoning. At 7 a.m., Bundy was strapped into the electric chair, grimly nicknamed Old Sparky. The preparation was methodical. His head was shaved to ensure a proper connection for the electrode cap, and a saline-soaked sponge was placed on his scalp. Another electrode was attached to his leg. The room was silent except for the faint sounds of the preparations, each action heightening the sense of dread. Among the 42 witnesses were journalists, prison officials, and some family members of Bundy's victims. Absent, however, was his mother, Louise, who had agreed with Bundy that she should not witness his execution. When asked if he had any final words, Bundy turned to his attorney and spiritual advisor and said, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." These were his last recorded words. At 7:16 a.m., the executioner pulled the switch, sending 2,000 volts of electricity through Bundy's body. Witnesses described seeing his body tense, his hands clenching as the current surged. Within minutes, it was over. Ted Bundy, the man who had terrorized the nation, was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, the crowd erupted in cheers. For many, Bundy's execution was not just a punishment, it was a moment of catharsis. Signs reading "Burn, Bundy, burn" reflected the collective relief of a nation haunted by his crimes. For the families of his victims, the moment was bittersweet. While justice had been served, no execution could undo the pain and loss they had endured. Ted Bundy's death marked the end of one of the most notorious crime sprees in American history. Between 1974 and 1978, he confessed to killing over 30 women, though the true number may never be known. His charm and intelligence had allowed him to evade capture for years, making his crimes all the more chilling. For many, his death was a necessary end to a nightmare that had long gripped the nation. Ricky Ray Rector was a man trapped in a child's mind, After committing 2 murders, a failed suicide attempt left him severely brain damaged. Unable to comprehend his execution, he spent his final day like a toddler, talking about food, asking simple questions, and showing no fear of death. Detached from reality, he faced his fate with an unsettling innocence, unaware of what was about to happen. The early life. Ricky Ray Rector was born on January 12, 1950, in Conway, Arkansas. He grew up in a small town where life was tough for most families, especially for those with limited income like his. Ricky was the third of 5 children in a household that struggled to make ends meet. His parents worked hard, but there was never enough to go around. Money was tight, and opportunities to break free from the cycle of poverty were even tighter. Ricky's family was close-knit, but their struggles often caused tension at home. The kids learned early on how to stretch every dollar and make do with what they had. Despite the hardships, neighbors and those who knew him as a child often remembered Ricky as a quiet boy. He didn't stand out much, blending into the background of the tight-knit community. But beneath the surface, his life was anything but simple. From an early age, Ricky had trouble in school. He wasn't disruptive or a troublemaker, but he had difficulty keeping up with his classmates. Reading and math were especially hard for him, and teachers noticed he seemed to zone out during lessons. While other kids played sports or joined clubs, Ricky often stayed on the sidelines. It wasn't because he didn't want to join in, it was more like he didn't know how to. By the time he was a teenager, Ricky's struggles in school began to take a toll. He started skipping classes and falling further behind. Teachers described him as polite but distant, someone who just couldn't seem to find his place. Friends came and went, and Ricky's confidence shrank with each passing year. He felt like the world was moving forward while he was stuck in one place. As Ricky entered his 20s, life didn't get much easier. He worked odd jobs to help support himself, but he never stayed in one place for very long. Construction work, manual labor, and other physically demanding jobs were the only options available to someone without an education or specialized skills. Ricky wasn't lazy, but his frustration with life's hardships grew over time. By his late 20s, Ricky's behavior began to change. Small incidents, like losing his temper at work or getting into minor disagreements with friends, became more frequent. One coworker recalled an argument that escalated so quickly it shocked everyone around. These moments didn't happen every day, but they hinted at deeper struggles Ricky was facing. He seemed stuck in a cycle of frustration and helplessness, unable to see a way out. Family and friends noticed that he was becoming more withdrawn, spending long hours alone and avoiding conversations about his future. Looking back, it's clear these were warning signs of the turmoil that would later define his life. The crimes. In early 1981, Ricky Ray Rector's life took a significant turn. At 31 years old, Rector was struggling with a sense of dissatisfaction and frustration. On the evening of March 21, 1981, these emotions came to a head. Rector had planned to attend a party at a local establishment, but things didn't go as expected. He was denied entry to the private gathering, which angered him. Instead of leaving, he lingered near the area, stewing over the perceived slight. The rejection seemed to ignite a deeper frustration within him, leading to decisions that would forever alter his life and the lives of others. The next evening, March 22, 1981, Rector entered Tommy's old-fashioned home-style restaurant in Conway, Arkansas. The restaurant was a familiar place in the community, and many people were there that night, including Rector's acquaintance, Arthur Criswell. Criswell was a friend of Rector's, but that night their interaction turned deadly. Rector, still upset from the previous evening, approached Criswell. Witnesses later recounted that there didn't seem to be any major argument or conflict between the two. Without warning, Rector pulled out a gun and shot Criswell, killing him instantly. The sudden act of violence shocked everyone present. In the chaos, 2 bystanders were also injured as Rector fired his weapon. The reasons for Rector's actions remain unclear, but his anger and frustration from the night before may have played a role. After the shooting, Rector fled the scene, leaving behind a community in shock and mourning. Police quickly identified him as the suspect, and a manhunt began. For 2 days, authorities searched for Rector, gathering evidence and questioning those who knew him. On March 24, 1981, police tracked Rector to his mother's home, where he was believed to be hiding. Officer Robert Martin, a well-respected member of the Conway Police Department with nearly 2 decades of service, was part of the team sent to apprehend Rector. Officer Martin approached the house, hoping to resolve the situation peacefully. However, as Martin engaged with Rector's family, Rector emerged with a firearm. Without hesitation, he shot Officer Martin, fatally wounding him. Martin died at the scene, becoming the second person Rector had killed in the span of just 2 days. The murder of a police officer heightened the urgency of the search for Rector and escalated the severity of his crimes. After shooting Officer Martin, Rector turned the gun on himself in what appeared to be a suicide attempt. He fired a shot into his own head, intending to end his life. However, the bullet did not kill him. Instead, it caused significant damage to his brain, leaving him severely impaired. Rector was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked to save his life. During the procedure, doctors removed a large portion of his frontal lobe, which had been destroyed by the gunshot. Although the surgery saved him, it left him with permanent brain damage. His cognitive abilities were greatly reduced, and he could no longer process complex thoughts or understand the consequences of his actions. This marked a turning point in Rector's story, as his mental state became a central issue in the legal battles that followed. Following his recovery, Rector was taken into custody and charged with multiple crimes, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case attracted significant attention due to the nature of the crimes and Rector's mental condition. His brain injury and its effects became a central focus of his trial, raising questions about his competence to stand trial and the ethical implications of pursuing the death penalty in his case. The trial. After his recovery from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, Ricky Ray Rector was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Rector was transferred to a secure facility, where his mental condition became a major factor in the case. His trial would raise questions about justice, fairness, and the treatment of individuals with severe mental impairments. Before the trial began, the court faced a critical question. Was Rector mentally fit to stand trial? His self-inflicted gunshot wound had caused severe brain damage, leaving him with significant cognitive impairments. Experts on both sides provided conflicting testimony. Some argued that Rector could not understand the proceedings or the consequences of his actions. Others claimed that despite his impairments, he was capable of participating in his defense. Judge George F. Hara ultimately ruled that Rector was competent to stand trial. The decision was based on the evidence presented, including evaluations by psychologists and psychiatrists. This ruling allowed the case to proceed, but it sparked a debate about whether justice could be served in such circumstances. The trial of Ricky Ray Rector began in 1982. It took place in a highly charged atmosphere, with strong emotions on both sides. The prosecution focused on the severity of Rector's crimes, emphasizing the killing of Officer Robert Martin, a respected member of the Conway Police Department. The defense, on the other hand, centered its arguments on Rector's mental condition. During the trial, the jury heard evidence about the events leading up to the murders. Witnesses recounted Rector's actions at Tommy's old-fashioned home-style restaurant, where he killed Arthur Criswell and injured 2 others. The prosecution also presented testimony about the fatal shooting of Officer Martin, highlighting the impact of Rector's actions on the community and the Martin family. The defense focused on Rector's cognitive impairments, calling on medical experts to explain the extent of his brain damage. They described how the gunshot wound had removed a significant portion of his frontal lobe, leaving him unable to process complex thoughts or plan his actions. Psychologists testified that Rector struggled to understand the trial process, often failing to grasp the significance of key moments. They argued that executing someone in Rector's condition would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. After deliberation, the jury found Ricky Ray Rector guilty of both counts of first-degree murder. The conviction was based on the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution, including eyewitness accounts and forensic findings. Despite the defense's arguments about Rector's mental state, the jury concluded that he was responsible for his actions. The court sentenced Rector to death for the murder of Officer Martin. The decision reflected the jury's belief that the severity of the crime warranted the maximum penalty. However, the sentence further fueled debates about the ethics of executing someone with severe cognitive impairments. Following his conviction, Rector's legal team pursued appeals in an effort to overturn the death sentence. They argued that the trial had failed to account for the full extent of Rector's impairments. Appeals focused on claims that Rector's execution would violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. The appeals process brought additional scrutiny to the case. Legal experts debated the standards for determining competency in capital cases, highlighting the challenges of balancing justice and compassion. Despite these efforts, the courts upheld Rector's conviction and death sentence, allowing the case to move forward. On death row, Rector spent much of his time in isolation. His interactions with other inmates and staff were limited, though he was noted for being generally cooperative. His routine was similar to that of other inmates on death row, consisting of meals, limited exercise, and time in his cell. However, his mental condition set him apart. Rector's cognitive impairments made it difficult for him to follow the structure of prison life. He required reminders for basic tasks and often appeared unaware of the passing of time. Despite this, he did not exhibit aggressive behavior and was generally regarded as a low-maintenance inmate by prison staff. The final 24 hours. On January 24, 1992, Ricky Ray Rector woke up in the Cummins unit in Arkansas, marking the beginning of his last day. His execution was scheduled for later that evening, and while the atmosphere in the prison grew tense, Rector followed his usual routine with no clear understanding of what lay ahead. At approximately 3 a.m., prison staff delivered his breakfast. The tray contained eggs, a hot dog, biscuits, and gravy. Rector ate only the hot dog before returning to sleep. His behavior reflected detachment rather than anxiety, likely a result of his cognitive impairments. Rector's brain injury caused severe mental impairments, limiting his understanding of abstract concepts like the future or the permanence of death. Throughout the day, his actions alternated between moments of childlike detachment and flashes of awareness, but his routine remained mostly undisturbed. According to some of the guards on duty that time, as dawn broke, Rector stirred in his cell and turned on the television. A local news broadcast discussing his execution caught his attention. For a brief moment, he seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the day, muttering softly about being in trouble. However, his reaction quickly shifted, and he began clapping his hands, dancing, and shouting nonsensical phrases. These moments of seemingly celebratory behavior underscored his inability to fully grasp the seriousness of his situation. Later in the morning, a guard woke Rector and asked if he needed anything. Rector requested a shower, which he took before returning to his cell with fresh linens. Afterward, he fell into a deep sleep, snoring loudly. When he awoke, his demeanor was calm, even casual. Speaking to the guard, he made matter-of-fact remarks about his execution, expressing neither fear nor resistance. At 10:44 a.m., Rector received what was described as his second-to-last meal. The tray included 2 pork chops, sweet potatoes, collard greens, 2 cups of Jell-O, and milk. He ate everything quickly, leaving nothing behind. His enthusiasm for the meal stood in contrast to the growing tension in the prison, highlighting his detachment from the reality of his impending execution. After eating, Rector announced that he intended to nap again. However, just a few minutes later, he was awake, stretching and pacing in his cell. As the day progressed, his movements became increasingly erratic. He began snapping his fingers, stomping his feet, and pacing back and forth. At one point, he barked like a dog, his actions seemingly disconnected from the solemnity of the situation. Later, he cried out loudly, calling for his mother in a haunting outburst that left a deep impression on those nearby. While Rector went about his day in the prison, his attorneys worked tirelessly outside to secure a last-minute reprieve. George Rosen, one of Rector's lawyers, spent the morning making frantic calls to Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Rosen argued that Rector's mental impairments made the execution ethically and legally questionable, emphasizing that his client did not fully comprehend the consequences of his actions or the significance of his execution. Despite Rosen's efforts, his pleas went unanswered. Governor Clinton, facing the pressures of a presidential campaign, had little political incentive to intervene. Clinton's tough-on-crime stance was a cornerstone of his campaign strategy, and overseeing Rector's execution became a key part of maintaining that image. By the afternoon, it was clear that no legal or political reprieve would come. Rector's fate was sealed. At noon, Chaplain Charles Pigman visited Rector in the prison's visitation center. They sat together at a small table, with Rector shackled in leg irons. During their conversation, Rector asked if they could sing together. Pigman agreed, and the two sang hymns, including Amazing Grace and a Sunday school song that Rector remembered from his childhood. The chaplain later described the moment as deeply emotional, as Rector seemed genuinely comforted by the music. Later in the afternoon, Reverend Colin Morton also visited Rector. During their conversation, Rector repeatedly asked about childhood friends who had passed away years earlier. Despite being told that they were no longer alive, he continued to inquire about them, even expressing a desire for some of them to serve as pallbearers at his funeral. Morton noted that these remarks reflected Rector's limited understanding of time and mortality. After praying together, Morton departed, leaving Rector alone once more. Throughout the day, Rector showed particular enthusiasm for his last meal. He repeatedly asked the guards about the timing of the meal, speaking with excitement about the steak and chicken he had requested. By the afternoon, his childlike anticipation for the meal became one of the few constants in his behavior. His comments about the food stood in stark contrast to the solemnity of the day, further emphasizing his inability to fully comprehend the events unfolding around him. At 2:57 p.m., Rector's final meal arrived. The tray included steak cooked well done, fried chicken smothered in gravy, brown beans, cherry Kool-Aid, and a slice of pecan pie. Rector greeted the meal with visible enthusiasm, snapping his fingers and smiling as he began eating. He took his time, savoring the meal, but left the pecan pie untouched. When asked why, he replied that he was saving it for later, a statement that highlighted his belief that he would return to his cell after the execution. As evening approached, Rector was moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber. He continued to interact with the guards in a calm and cooperative manner, showing no signs of resistance or fear. His demeanor reflected his limited understanding of the finality of his situation. At approximately 9 p.m., 7 guards in riot gear arrived at Rector's cell. They flanked him as he was escorted down a narrow corridor to the execution chamber. Witnesses, including Reverend Morton, Attorney George Rosen, and law enforcement officials, gathered in the viewing room to observe the execution. The room was quiet, filled with tension, as everyone prepared for the final moments. Once Rector was strapped to the gurney, the medical team encountered difficulties locating a suitable vein for the lethal injection. The muffled sounds of their struggle could be heard in the viewing room, where witnesses waited uneasily. The delay stretched from minutes to nearly an hour, creating a tense and uncomfortable atmosphere. The medical team, initially consisting of 2 technicians, expanded to 5 as additional staff were called in to assist. Midnight loomed as a critical deadline. If the execution did not proceed by then, it would have to be postponed. Eventually, the medical team succeeded in finding a vein, and the process resumed. Rector, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, was given the opportunity to speak his final words. His remarks referenced his faith and baptism before the lethal injection began. The execution involved the administration of 3 drugs: sodium pentothal to induce unconsciousness, Pavilon to paralyze the lungs, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. As the drugs entered his system, Rector's eyes closed and his breathing slowed. The green line on the heart monitor began to waver as his body grew still. Witnesses leaned forward, watching intently as the monitor flatlined. At 10:09 p.m., Ricky Ray Rector was pronounced dead. The execution of Ricky Ray Rector remains one of the most debated cases in the history of capital punishment. His severe cognitive impairments raised significant ethical questions about the justice of executing individuals with such conditions. For some, Rector's execution represented justice for the victims of his crimes. For others, it highlighted the flaws in a system that failed to adequately address the complexities of mental health and criminal responsibility. Governor Clinton's role in the execution added a layer of political significance to the event. Critics argued that Clinton's decision to allow the execution to proceed was driven by his presidential ambitions, while supporters viewed it as a demonstration of his commitment to upholding the law. Gary Gilmore wasn't your typical death row inmate. Unlike others who begged for mercy, he fought against appeals, rejected salvation, and faced death without regret. His murders had no pattern, no motive, just a man who killed for the sake of killing, with nothing to lose. And with his infamous last words, "Let's do it," he became a pop culture phenomenon, etching his defiance into history in a way few ever have. Early life. Gary Gilmore's story began in McCamey, Texas, where he was born on December 4, 1940. His family life was anything but stable. Frank, his father, was a man of constant anger and unyielding discipline. Gary and his siblings often had to deal with Frank's violent temper, and the effects were lasting. His mother, Bessie, on the other hand, while more nurturing, imposed a strict religious household that clashed with Gary's rebellious nature. The family moved frequently, chasing stability and financial freedom that never seemed to materialize. From town to town, the children struggled to make friends and find consistency. Gary, in particular, felt the impact of this nomadic lifestyle. According to sources, even as a child, he got into a heated argument with his parents that ended with shattered plates and broken appliances and terrified children. School was no refuge for Gary. From the beginning, he was labeled a troublemaker. He clashed with teachers, refused to follow rules, and often ended up in the principal's office. As Gary entered his teenage years, his frustration began to manifest in more destructive ways. Petty theft and vandalism became common occurrences, acts that gave him a fleeting sense of control in a world where he felt powerless. His first encounters with the law came during this period, with arrests for breaking into the cars of strangers and shoplifting. Each time he was caught, the cycle of punishment and rebellion grew stronger. Juvenile detention became a revolving door, and the interventions he received did little to address the underlying causes of his behavior. Instead of rehabilitation, these experiences reinforced his mistrust of authority and deepened his anger. Despite his struggles, Gary wasn't without ambition. He had a talent for drawing and often sketched detailed images that hinted at a creative mind. For a time, he entertained dreams of becoming an artist, even discussing the possibility of attending art school. But those aspirations always seemed just out of reach. Whether it was lack of support, financial constraints, or his own self-sabotaging tendencies, Gary could never take the steps needed to turn his dreams into reality. The creative potential he had remained untapped, buried beneath layers of frustration and anger. Gary's relationships with his family were complicated. He had moments of closeness with his mother, who tried to shield him from his father's wrath, but their bond was strained by her strict expectations. His siblings, too, were both allies and adversaries. While they occasionally banded together to weather Frank's outbursts, they also fought amongst themselves, competing for attention and resources in a chaotic household. As Gary grew older, these relationships became more distant. His anger and impulsiveness isolated him from the people who might have helped him, leaving him to navigate his struggles alone. By the time Gary reached his late teens, his behavior had taken a darker turn. His crimes became more frequent and bold, his temper more volatile. Alcohol and other substances entered the picture, further fueling his reckless behavior. The crimes. After years of drifting through life, Gary Gilmore's descent into crime became almost inevitable. Released from prison in April 1976 after serving over a decade for robbery, Gilmore seemed poised for a fresh start. His release was conditional upon living with a distant relative, his cousin Brenda Nickel, in Provo, Utah. Brenda, an optimistic woman with a strong sense of faith, hoped she could guide Gary toward redemption. However, Gary's demons proved difficult to tame. Provo was very different from the life Gary had known. Provo's deeply religious community offered stability, but it also imposed restrictions that felt suffocating to someone as volatile as Gilmore. He initially tried to adjust, taking a job at a shoe repair shop and even reconnecting with his family. Brenda encouraged him to attend church, but Gary's rebellious nature made it clear he wasn't interested in conforming. However, a significant turning point came when Gary met Nicole Baker Barrett, a young and strikingly beautiful single mother of two. Their relationship was intense, passionate, and chaotic. Nicole had her own struggles, including a history of troubled relationships, and Gary's volatile behavior quickly escalated into possessiveness and jealousy. Their love affair, which began as a chaotic romance, became a toxic spiral. By July 1976, Gary's life was in disarray. He had lost his job due to erratic behavior and began drinking heavily. His relationship with Nicole was on the brink of collapse, and his cousin Brenda, who had initially supported him, was growing increasingly frustrated with his refusal to change. Desperate for money and consumed by anger, Gary turned to what he knew best: crime. On the evening of July 19, 1976, Gary Gilmore, freshly out of prison and already on a destructive path, arrived at a Sinclair gas station in Orem, Utah. Armed with a .22 caliber pistol, he entered the small, brightly lit building where Max Jensen, a 24-year-old gas station attendant, was working the evening shift. Jensen, a soft-spoken young man known for his kind and easygoing nature, had recently graduated from Brigham Young University and was working at the station to support his young family. Jensen's shift had been quiet, with only a handful of customers stopping by. The station was located on a quiet road, a far cry from the bustling streets of nearby Salt Lake City. Jensen was alone that night, as he often was during his shifts, making him a vulnerable target for someone like Gilmore, who was desperate for money and willing to do anything to get it. Gilmore entered the station with a calm demeanor, his pistol concealed but ready. He approached Jensen and demanded money from the register. Jensen, startled but cooperative, complied immediately. The amount of cash in the till was small, only about 125s, but Gilmore's intent was far from satisfied. Without giving Jensen a chance to react, Gilmore ordered him to lie face down on the cold, hard floor. Jensen obeyed without hesitation. In a move both calculated and senseless, Gilmore raised his pistol and shot Jensen in the back of the head at point-blank range. The young man died instantly. There was no struggle, no attempt to fight back. Jensen had done everything Gilmore asked, yet the act was carried out with cold precision. Gilmore didn't say a word as he left the gas station, walking back to his car and driving off into the dark night as though nothing had happened. The murder was as shocking as it was inexplicable. Max Jensen was a man described by those who knew him as gentle, hardworking, and deeply committed to his family and faith. A recent graduate with dreams of building a better future, he was the type of person least likely to provoke violence. His murder left friends and family reeling, unable to comprehend the senselessness of the act. Jensen's wife, who was at home waiting for him to return from his shift, was devastated by the news. He had been married for less than 2 years and was preparing for the birth of their first child. Local law enforcement was immediately called to the scene, but clues were scarce. The crime appeared random, with no clear motive other than robbery. Witnesses from nearby businesses reported hearing a loud bang, but didn't see anything unusual. The small amount of money taken, combined with the execution-style killing, left investigators struggling to piece together the mindset of a killer who seemed to act without reason. For the quiet community of Orem, Jensen's murder was a wake-up call. The area, known for its low crime rates and family-friendly atmosphere, was unprepared for such a brutal act of violence. Residents were shocked, fearful that something so horrific could happen in their seemingly safe neighborhood. Gilmore's actions that night revealed a disturbing lack of humanity. He had no personal connection to Max Jensen, no vendetta, no anger, just a cold determination to satisfy his own immediate needs, no matter the cost. For law enforcement, the killing raised the stakes. They knew they were dealing with someone who wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Less than 24 hours later, on July 20th, Gilmore struck again. This time, his target was Benny Bushnell, a 25-year-old motel manager in Provo. Bushnell, like Jensen, was compliant and cooperative when Gilmore demanded money. After pocketing the cash, Gilmore ordered Bushnell into a back room. Echoing the same method as the night before, he shot Bushnell in the head at point-blank range. The brutality of the act left no doubt that Gilmore's spree was deliberate and calculated. Unlike the first murder, this one left behind critical evidence. Gilmore accidentally left his blood-stained shirt and shoes at the scene, linking him directly to the crime. Witnesses also reported seeing his distinctive Ford truck near the motel, further narrowing the list of suspects. Gilmore's downfall came swiftly. Aware that police were closing in, and he turned to Brenda for help. She was horrified to learn of the murders and, fearing for her own safety, alerted the authorities. On July 21, 1976, just a day after the second murder, Gary Gilmore was arrested. When police questioned him, Gilmore remained defiant and uncooperative. He didn't deny the crimes outright, but he offered no explanations either. His demeanor was cold, almost indifferent, as though the weight of his actions hadn't fully registered. Psychologists later examined Gilmore's mental state, suggesting a combination of antisocial tendencies, unresolved trauma, and impulsive aggression. His crimes were seen as the culmination of years of pent-up rage, self-destruction, and a complete disregard for human life. The murders sent shockwaves through Utah's tight-knit communities. Both Max Jensen and Benny Bushnell were young men with bright futures, their lives senselessly cut short. For Brenda Nicole, the ordeal was particularly harrowing. She had welcomed Gary into her home, believing she could help him turn his life around. Instead, she became a key figure in his capture, a decision that weighed heavily on her for years to come. Vigils were held, and residents struggled to come to terms with the violence that had shattered their sense of safety. The trial. Gary Gilmore's trial for the murders of Max Jensen and Benny Bushnell was as swift as it was sensational. From the moment he was arrested on July 21, 1976, Gilmore became a figure of intense media scrutiny, his cold demeanor and disturbing crimes captivating a nation that hadn't seen an execution in nearly a decade. Gilmore was charged with the murder of Benny Bushnell, with prosecutors focusing on this case due to the overwhelming evidence left behind at the scene. His blood-stained shirt and shoes, along with eyewitness accounts linking his truck to the motel, made it nearly impossible for him to claim innocence. Although Gilmore was also suspected in the murder of Max Jensen, the prosecution opted to streamline the process by concentrating on Bushnell's case, knowing it would likely lead to the same outcome. The trial began on October 5, 1976, in Provo, Utah. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, packed with reporters, spectators, and family members of both the victims and the accused. Gilmore, defiant as ever, seemed indifferent to the proceedings. His demeanor was cold and unrepentant. According to eyewitness reports, he would occasionally smirk, which made him a disturbing presence in the courtroom. The prosecution built a strong case, relying on physical evidence, witness testimonies, and Gilmore's own incriminating behavior. The defense, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle. Gilmore had shown little interest in cooperating with his attorneys, even refusing to plead not guilty. Instead, he insisted on accepting responsibility for his actions, a decision that stunned his legal team and further expedited the trial. After just 2 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On October 7, 1976, Gary Gilmore was found guilty of first-degree murder. The swift verdict was met with little surprise, given the mountain of evidence against him. During the sentencing phase, Gilmore's actions once again shocked everyone. When asked if he had any final words before sentencing, he chose not to plead for mercy or express regret. Instead, he doubled down, requesting the death penalty. His exact words, "You sentenced me to die, let's do it," became infamous. The judge granted his request, sentencing him to death by firing squad. Utah was one of the few states that still allowed this method of execution, and Gilmore's preference for it only added to the media frenzy surrounding his case. Unlike many inmates sentenced to death, who spend years or even decades filing appeals, Gary Gilmore had no interest in delaying his execution. In fact, he actively fought against attempts to appeal his sentence, declaring that he wanted to die as soon as possible. His stance made him a polarizing figure, with some praising his acceptance of justice and others questioning the ethics of carrying out his sentence. Gilmore was transferred to Utah State Prison, where he awaited execution. His time on death row was marked by a series of dramatic and bizarre events. His relationship with Nicole Barrett, which had already been tumultuous, took on an almost Shakespearean quality. Nicole, devastated by the situation, attempted suicide multiple times during this period, and her letters to Gilmore became a lifeline for both of them. The two exchanged passionate and emotional correspondence, with Gilmore professing his love for her even as he faced the end of his life. Gilmore's case quickly became a media spectacle. The fact that he was the first person sentenced to die after the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in Gregg v. Georgia added historical significance to his execution. Journalists from around the country descended on Utah, eager to cover the case and the man at its center. The final 24 hours. As the clock counted down to January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore remained steadfast in his decision to face execution. Unlike most death row inmates who exhaust every appeal, Gilmore had fought for his sentence to be carried out, rejecting delays and any attempts to overturn it. His final hours reflected a man who had made peace with his fate. On the night of January 16th, Gilmore spent time in quiet reflection. A priest visited him in his cell, and they spoke about religion and the afterlife, though Gilmore remained ambivalent about his beliefs. Despite the opportunity for spiritual solace, he showed little sign of remorse for his crimes. His focus instead seemed to rest on the inevitability of what was to come. In the early hours of January 17th, he sat awake in his cell, aware that the morning would mark the end of his turbulent life. The weight of this reality did not seem to unnerve him. Instead, he appeared calm and resolute. as though the prospect of execution brought him a sense of control he had lacked in life. As the prison began to stir, Gilmore maintained his composure. Guards arrived to prepare him, and his routine was methodical. He shaved, dressed in fresh clothes, and sat quietly in his cell. When asked about his last meal, Gilmore initially joked about requesting 6 packs of beer, but eventually opted for a simple breakfast of eggs, hamburger, potatoes, and coffee. He ate without comment, treating the meal as just another part of the day. While Gilmore projected a calm demeanor inside the prison, the atmosphere outside was chaotic. Protesters had gathered, some advocating against the death penalty, while others supported the execution as a necessary act of justice. The debate surrounding Gilmore's case had divided the nation, with his execution representing the first in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. Inside the prison, tension mounted among the staff. Guards carried out their duties with quiet resolve, fully aware of the historical significance of the moment. The legal battles that had delayed Gilmore's execution, including a last-minute stay issued the previous night, were still fresh in everyone's minds. However, the Supreme Court had overturned the stay at 7:30 a.m., ensuring that the execution would proceed as planned. Meanwhile, Gilmore spent these final hours writing letters, including one to Nicole Barrett, the woman whose tumultuous relationship with him had defined much of his later life. Despite being separated and her recent admission to a psychiatric hospital, Gilmore's feelings for her remained intense. His letter was short but emotional, urging her to escape the pain that had consumed both of them. Gilmore also interacted with prison staff, maintaining his composure and even making a few dark jokes. He had made it clear that he wanted to face his fate without fear or regret. At 7:53 a.m., Gilmore was escorted from his maximum security cell to the execution site. The journey was brief, less than a mile, but it marked the final steps of a long and tumultuous life. The site, an abandoned cannery, repurposed as the Death House, was stark and functional, designed to facilitate executions with minimal ceremony. Inside the execution chamber, Gilmore was strapped into a chair. Nylon straps secured his arms and legs, and a wall of sandbags was positioned behind him to absorb the bullets. Despite his repeated requests to face his death standing and without a hood, both were denied. He would remain seated with a black hood placed over his head. The audience for his final moments was carefully selected. Among the witnesses were his Uncle Vern, filmmakers like Larry Schiller, and his attorneys, Ronald Stanger and Robert Moody. Nicole Barrett, though invited, was absent, her mental health preventing her attendance. Journalists, barred from witnessing the event directly, waited nearby to report on what would become one of the most significant moments in modern criminal justice history. When the witnesses arrived, they found Gilmore calm and composed, already seated in the execution chair. Warden Sam Smith stood solemnly before him and began reading the death warrant. Gilmore listened without reaction, his gaze occasionally shifting toward the screen concealing the firing squad. When asked if he had any final words, Gilmore's response was immediate and chilling. "Let's do it." Those 3 words, which encapsulated his defiant attitude, became his obituary and would later inspire pop culture references, including Nike's famous slogan, "Just do it." At precisely 8:05 a.m., the execution team took their positions. The firing squad, composed of 5 anonymous marksmen, stood behind a screen to ensure anonymity. Each was armed with a Winchester Model 94 rifle, loaded with 30 caliber cartridges. In keeping with tradition, one rifle was loaded with a blank round, allowing the shooters to avoid certainty over who fired the fatal shot. A prison doctor stepped forward to affix a white target over Gilmore's heart, ensuring that the marksman could aim with precision. The room fell silent as the team prepared to carry out their task. At the command, the rifles fired in unison. The bullets struck their target, causing Gilmore's body to jolt as the impact forced his head to turn slightly to the left. His hands twitched briefly before falling still. Within 20 seconds, all movement ceased. The prison doctor approached to confirm the outcome, checking for a pulse and listening for a heartbeat. At exactly 8:07 a.m., Gary Gilmore was pronounced dead. Gilmore's execution was not the end of his story. Within hours, his final request to donate his organs was honored. His corneas were transplanted, restoring sight to 2 individuals. This act of generosity stood in stark contrast to the violence and destruction that had defined much of his life. Norman Mailer's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Executioner's Song, would later immortalize Gilmore's story, ensuring that his life and death would remain a topic of discussion for generations.